Welcome to Valor, Strength of Mind. Today, we're going to be learning about trauma. Trauma is a word that we're all familiar with, and for the most part, we have the basic understanding that trauma means a very difficult experience that somebody lived through. However, very few of us actually know what trauma is, how to identify the different types of trauma that there are, and the effects that trauma has in our life long term. So today we're going to be learning just that. What are the impacts that trauma has on different areas of our lives? So let's begin by identifying or defining what trauma is. Trauma is defined as a very disturbing, distressing experience that leaves people so emotionally overwhelmed to the point that they can't cope with that situation. Trauma leaves us feeling helpless and can also cause us to be emotionally numb, which means that we have a very difficult time understanding emotions and feeling a different range of emotions. So why does trauma matter? Simple. Trauma matters because unresolved trauma actually has negative effects on different areas of our lives. And this includes our brain development, our physical, emotional, and mental health, and also the way that we build relationships and connect to others. Let's begin by understanding how does trauma impact our brain development and our physical health. A great study that was conducted from 1995 to 1998 was something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what that study was, it was a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control because they wanted to really understand what caused people to develop serious health conditions. And what they found wasn't necessarily physical traits that cause people to be more susceptible to develop these serious health conditions such as stroke, heart disease, or cancer, but they actually found something called adverse childhood experiences. And what that really is, it's a long term or a long phrase just to pretty much say trauma. Now, they broke it down into 10 different traumas. And those 10 different traumas were domestic violence, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, emotional neglect, having a parent who was an alcoholic or a substance user, having a parent abandon you or witnessing a separation or a divorce, a parent who went in and out of jail, a parent who struggled with a mental illness, or being sexually abused, fondled or molested by a person 5 years older than you. Now, what the study found is that these different experiences actually impact brain development very significantly. Our brain actually has a system called the limbic system. And I know that's a pretty fancy term, but really what the limbic system does is that it's in charge of our response to danger. So when we hear about fight, freeze, or flight, that is called our survival mode, and our brains are designed to protect us and help us survive. But what ends up happening is that when we're in a situation that's dangerous or stressful, that is the actual part of our brain that activates. And that is a good thing whenever we need to be protected from danger. But what happens is that when you are living in constant trauma, this limbic system is actually overstimulated. So what ends up happening is that in response to that, your brain begins to release hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. And these hormones in large amounts are actually negative to our health. So part of understanding trauma was really understanding that the brain actually is affected in more ways than we know. Because trauma actually impacts the brain's ability to retain memory, to be able to control impulses, and actually our ability to be able to manage difficult emotions. So people who have experienced trauma may sometimes have a very difficult time regulating their emotions. So you may see that they may go from 0 to 100 really quick, they can be very explosive, or they may not feel anything at all. You can also find that people who have experienced trauma are more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviors because, again, impulse control is affected. And if you're not able to control your impulses or think ahead, then you're more than likely to engage in these behaviors. Another reason for that is that people who experience trauma may have a difficult time managing those emotions and therefore may turn to things such as substances to try to manage some of the negative effects of trauma. And lastly, trauma also affects our ability to retain memory. Oftentimes, when we work with people who have experienced trauma, we find that they have a very difficult time remembering parts of their childhood or even parts of the traumatic event. What happens is that our brain tries to protect us by actually blocking some of these memories. So that is how trauma actually impacts our brain. Now, this affects our body because, as I mentioned, when cortisol and adrenaline are produced in over amounts, it begins to affect our health in negative ways. In fact, the study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the Center of Disease Control actually found that trauma is more common than not. About 67% of the population has at least one trauma, and 12 to 13% of the population has experienced 4 or more traumas. And they were able to connect that 4 or more traumas actually led to a person having a lifespan or living 20 years less than a person who didn't have the 4 traumas. It also found that people with 4 or more traumas were 2 to 3 times more likely to develop cancer or chronic lung disease. And interesting enough, they also found that people with 4 or more traumas were actually 12 to 15% more likely to develop a mental health illness and attempt suicide. So trauma, as we mentioned, actually affects us more than what we understand. Now let's talk about how mental health is impacted by trauma. People who experience trauma are more likely to develop depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is PTSD. Now, these illnesses are pretty debilitating illnesses because depression, anxiety, and PTSD can oftentimes drain a person out of their entire energy. You experience things such as low energy, difficulty sleeping or oversleeping. Sometimes you can experience nightmares, you withdraw from the people that you love, and it makes it so difficult to the point where sometimes people with these mental health illnesses can't even function normally. They can't have a job or healthy relationships like other people do because the emotion in the traumatic event is so overwhelming that it takes over every single aspect of their lives. And that is important to understand because when we understand that a lot of the physical symptoms or emotional symptoms and behaviors that we're having are associated with trauma, then we can actually begin to really talk about how do we begin to heal. If we experience trauma as children, then more than likely we had parents who were either abusive or were emotionally unavailable. Not because they wanted to, but because again, they were all part of the dysfunction of what trauma is. Now, when this happens, we begin to grow up with something called an unhealthy attachment. And what unhealthy attachment does is that we develop this perception that we can't trust people because our caregivers or our parents, which is where we develop our first healthy relationship, didn't really provide that for us. And this impacts our relationships long term because more than likely, if you experience trauma and didn't have healthy attachments, you will find that you have a very hard time trusting people. You also can become extremely independent, not because you want to, but because you truly believe that people are not reliable or can be trusted. Or when you are in a situation where things are going really well, whether that's in your relationship or personal life, you begin to develop anxiety of believing that something may go wrong. And again, that all has to do with the cycle of trauma. Typically in trauma, there's a point where things go really well and then chaos happens. So we begin to reenact a lot of these experiences or think that they're gonna re-happen. And the really interesting part of that is that sometimes we even self-sabotage, which means that we ourselves put ourselves down and tell ourselves that we're not good enough, or we walk away from things that may be positive for us because we believe that it's not going to happen for us. And again, that's part of the dysfunction of trauma. Now, all of this is really important information to know. And I don't want to discourage you into thinking that, man, I have all these things that I've been affected by trauma. How am I going to have a normal life? Well, that is the beauty of that. Just like with physical illnesses, when we're sick, we go to the doctor. And the reason for that is that we want to find out what is the root of our illness. The same thing is with trauma. The purpose of this video is really to give you information so that you can begin to identify what are the different traumas in your life. Aside from the adverse childhood experiences or the 10 things that I talked about childhood trauma, there's also different types of trauma. Bullying can be considered a trauma, losing a loved one, going through a divorce or separation, being stalked, or experiencing a very, very difficult community event or car accident can also be considered a trauma. A trauma is not defined by an event. It's actually defined by the emotional reaction that a person has to it. So it can be any type of event, but if you have a deep, disturbing reaction to that, to the point where you are extremely overwhelmed and can't cope with that, then that is considered a trauma. And the wonderful part of understanding trauma is that when we understand what is causing a lot of what we are experiencing now, then we can begin to heal. So how can we begin to heal from trauma? The wonderful thing about this is that the journey to healing from trauma can actually look very different for people. And there's very different methods that you can try. You can try watching videos like the one you're watching today, because being able to understand and get more informed about how trauma affects us is very powerful. When we have knowledge of that, we can actually decide what we want to do and what the next step in healing will be. There's also things such as support groups that you can join. You can read books that talk about personal self-growth. You can practice things such as gardening, meditation, and utilizing music or exercise to be able to release some of the emotions that may come with trauma. Or there's also options such as therapy. Many community agencies or mental health community agencies offer therapy services to many individuals, both adults and children. If you have children, there's many resources available for children as well. In fact, many schools now even have mental health professionals or school social workers within the school system that offer supports to your children. Regardless of the step that you decide to take in beginning your journey of healing, the important thing is that you are beginning that journey towards healing from trauma. And if you're watching this video, I want to really applaud you and tell you that I admire you and respect you. Because more than likely, if you are watching this video, then you are trying to overcome trauma and break the vicious cycle of trauma and unhealthy patterns that have been passed down to you. And I want to applaud you and tell you how brave you are, because I know firsthand how difficult that is. It is not easy to confront a lot of the emotions that we have been trying to avoid for such a long time, because it's very painful. But I can assure you that if we go through this journey, we're going to come out 1,000 times better, because being able to heal from trauma gives us a power that nobody else can take away. And I want you to know that if you are watching this video, you will succeed. You can and you will be able to overcome trauma. So I thank you, my friends, and I admire you immensely. And in whatever you do, I encourage you to continue on and carry on with valor. Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I would love to hear from you in your comments, and also know if there's any other topics that you would want me to talk about. If you want to learn more about adverse childhood experiences, you can go to my website, which is www.valorstrengthofmind.com, and I will be posting under resources the study that I talked about. You can also go to YouTube and actually look up Adverse Childhood Experiences TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Brooke Harris. She does an amazing job going more into detail about how does trauma affect our brain and also our physical health. Don't forget that you can also follow me on Instagram at Valor Strength of Mind. And next week, I will be posting another video on Thursday at 6 o'clock. Don't miss it. Next week, we're going to be talking about healthy relationships versus toxic relationships. So thank you, my friends, and remember to carry on with valor.